Just as it does today, fashion and necessity dictated what people wore during the Middle Ages. Cultural traditions were wide-ranging across Europe and Asia, as were the materials available. Fashion would depend on the century that the man or woman lived in, and where they lived, and what their position was in society. Obviously, a 15th century Venetian's clothes would look nothing like that of a 7th century Viking, but that doesn't mean that their outfits weren't equally as ridiculous by today's standards. Hey, welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest and the weirdest facts from human history. So join us today as we find out what fashion was like in the Middle Ages. Fashion did change quite slowly. Today we find some of the trends that were popular in the Middle Age were really silly. Like the 18-inch chopin platform shoes of the Italian aristocracy, which looked like honestly something straight out of a sci-fi movie, or the ridiculously long-sleeved dresses. For the most part, clothing was made of three main materials. It was made of linen, wool, and silk. They were all manufactured in a range of different weights. The finer the weave, the more expensive and softer the material was likely to be. Fabrics such as taffeta and velvet were made for the wealthier wearer and weren't really available until the later medieval period. After the 10th century, fur became fashionable as a sign of status. But before this time, it was thought to be too vulgar to wear because of its use by barbarians, and then those who wore fur were seen as savage. The use of colors was also very highly contested, as the poor weren't able to get clothes that had these bright, attractive colors. Colors were looked on as a sign of status, as they were made from rare insects, plants, and mollusks. Again, fashion changed quite slowly between the 5th and 12th centuries, and the men of this period usually wore a tunic or in some form of legging. The basic T-shaped tunic would have sleeves and a hole for the neck. And it was made for men in the Middle Ages, and it really honestly looks like circus performer outfits. Soldiers and peasants would wear them at knee length or shorter so that they weren't hindered in their daily work, and then in warmer climates, trousers might not even be worn at all. Yeah, you heard that right. The summer men would just work in a large shirt. Yeah, they were walking around feeling that good breeze. Silk would have been an ideal choice, but it was only used for clothing of the nobility and was usually brought in from the Byzantine Empire, as only the elites were able to afford the costs involved with importing luxury goods from outside of Europe. Cotton was also brought in from Egypt and other countries of the East, and sometimes these tunics would fall all the way to the floor and they were extravagantly embellished. In Western Europe, a cloak or a mantle was sometimes thrown over the shoulders, especially in winter. This served the same purposes as an overcoat, basically, but, as I said earlier, the poor couldn't really afford these imported pieces, so they would regularly just freeze in the winter. Other decorative items included belts, buckles, and metal purses, and these were also worn by the elite during the early Middle Ages. The significant influence of the church ruled society during the time, so it's not entirely surprising that women always wore the same type of head covering in public to naturally preserve modesty. A simple veil would be held on by a headband or a circlet, and no respectable woman would be seen without one, as it was seen as a temptation to all the good men out there. Going outside without covering her hair for a woman would leave herself open to suspicion and gossip, and they would be accused of being whores, which would sadly end in the execution of the woman accused. Peasants in the fields wore straw hats to protect them from the sun, and this remained unchanged throughout the centuries. Men also wore chaperones, which were basically a hood and a cape all in one piece. And this honestly made them look like modern-day superheroes. Sometimes the cape was scalloped for decoration, and the hood would end in a pointy tail, and they were both worn by men and women of the lower classes in Northern Europe. They were made from wool for warmth in the winter and linen for shade in the warmer months. Wimples were worn mostly by married women in the 10th and 14th centuries, which covered the head, the neck, and the chin. By the end of the Middle Ages, the tall headdresses known as a hennin was in vogue, and it was worn at a 45-degree angle at the back of the head. This very long steeple hennin was only popular in Europe for about 50 years. But it wasn't very practical, because it kept, if you could imagine, a gigantic hat bulging out from the sides of you, it kept getting hit on ledges. It was then succeeded by the more practical low hoods and caps. Shoes were worn by all classes, even the very, very poor who wore simple shoes made from leather. This was super uncomfortable, however, and would often lead to diseases like athlete's foot, and in extreme cases the foot had to be amputated. The basic design and style of the shoes remained the same throughout the medieval period. For the richer buyer, better quality materials and finer details were added, which weren't as harsh to their feet. The leather could then be decorated with cutwork patterns or stamping, which were popular with both sexes. For the nobility and royalty, shoes were gilded or studded with pearls and jewels. By the 12th century, pointed shoes were becoming very popular in England, and over the years, the length had become more and more exaggerated, and by the 15th century, some had toes up to 24 inches long. They were stuffed with all sorts of materials to keep their shape, like moss, hair, wool, or grass. And these shoes were often frowned upon by the church because of their, phallic shape. Because of the improvement of wages and living standards after the Black Death, laws were brought in to stop the lower classes from dressing like their social superiors. Yep, if you were a lower class earner, you were expected to dress poor. Sanctuary laws attempted to limit the people from buying luxury items of food, clothing, furniture. The laws of 1363 limited the types of fur and fabric that could be worn. The toe length on shoes is also limited because some people are clearly just too poor to deserve 24 inches at the end of their shoes. Yep, only the nobility could wear shoes with toes longer than 2 inches, and in 1483 in England, the wearing of fabrics such as velvet and cloth of gold was limited to knights and lords. Anybody of lower status seen wearing these types of fabrics would be accused of thievery and taken to be just executed. At this stage, European fashions began to change at a much faster pace, especially for women. The Crusades and the exploration of other continents by adventurers such as Marco Polo introduced new styles from other cultures. Tunics became tighter for both sexes, women's gowns became fitted from the shoulder to below the waist. Longer sleeves, wired into a bell shape, and were sometimes so long that they touched the ground, were being fitted around the body with armholes that were far too tight, and with sleeves that were far too long. The 12th and 13th century clothing was just uncomfortable and awkward to wear. And this trend for tighter clothing inspired men to keep a slim physique. Men wore linen breeches and shirts as undergarments with woolen hose to cover the legs, just like women's leggings today. On top of the shirts, a buttoned doublet was worn and would often have skirting or pleating at the hem, and slashes were made in the sleeves which showed the undertunic beneath, as this was pulled through to produce the billows of contrast in both color and fabric. Some popular musician Lil Nas X took a page from this style book of the Middle Ages. So with all the words that I've just spoken at you, what do you think of the fashion during the Middle Ages? Would you wear any of these pieces we just mentioned? Tell me your comments down in the answer section below. I said that backwards. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that bell so you don't miss any videos we produce for you, because we got a lot of interesting things loaded in the pipeline for you. So, I'll see you soon.